Thanks everyone for coming. So this is Nathan, and he is the co-founder and creative director at Roadtrip Nation. And he started his first road trip back in 2001, I believe.
2001.
So he's going to tell you a little bit more about his current book, Roadmap, and he has a few co-authors with him today as well. We'll go through his presentation. If you have questions, there's time at the end, and then there's books available for book signing, and you can come talk to him and the other authors as well. So thank you.
Sweet. Well, thanks for coming, you guys. I'm going to kind of just walk you guys through the story of Roadtrip Nation and our new book. And as Caroline said before, we've got a few co-authors here that will join us. So Alyssa, Jamie, Willie, and Annie will come up on stage for the Q&A part. So just to give you a little sense of Roadtrip, this is kind of, when people ask, like, what is Roadtrip? What do you guys do? This is the, like, simple sentence. We create experiences that empower individuals to build livelihoods around their interests. And I think it took us a while to put that sentence together and to really feel comfortable with it. Because I think the underlying piece is that it really came from a much more rough and uncertain question, which was, what am I going to do with my life? So in 2001, myself and two other co-founders, Mike and Brian, were about ready to graduate from college and just realized, like, we were sitting there in a situation where the lives that we were about to lead were not our own. So Mike was double major biology, kinesiology major. He had always thought he was going to be a doctor. His entire family was a family of doctors. And through one internship, he realized he hated hospitals and that was just not going to be his life. Brian was third generation in a about to become third generation in a family business. So he was able to look at his dad and see what life would be like 20 years from now. He was able to look at his grandpa and see what life was like in 40 years. And so those two were in a very similar situation as I was. I was really interested in, like, I wouldn't even say art, but just like being creative. But I had this inability to articulate what being creative meant to, like, an occupation. And so when I told my parents, like, yeah, I'm thinking about, like, I want to do something creative, like, the only, like, thing I could get out of my mouth was painter. And that was the only, like, artsy people that I was exposed to in my community. And I remember my parents just, like, totally just like, like, yeah, you're going to be poor and homeless and live under the boardwalk if you're a painter. And I used to think that was really, like, a painful comment, but now that I really reflect back on it, like, it was so accurate because I'm a horrible painter. Like, I really can't, like, my 6-year-old daughter can paint much better than I can. It was just that I didn't understand how to articulate something different. And so when I was looking at school, was looking at trying to figure out what to do, I kind of just totally abandoned that interest in being creative. And I listened to kind of that societal kind of expectation of be successful. And I majored in business because I thought that's what you're supposed to do. Just go do something that makes a lot of money and you'll be fine. And it was about the time when I was getting ready to graduate. I was literally, like, just a few months from, like, becoming the consultant, which was, like, the assembly line of everybody in my business major were consultants. And I realized at a career fair when I was passing out my resume that I had no idea what a consultant does. And so I asked this guy, like, hey, could I just take you out to lunch and learn about what this thing is that I'm about to become? And the only thing I remember from that lunch is he was wearing a suit. And obviously by my dress today, like, suits do not connect with who I am as an individual. And it just, like, my blood was draining, like, the entire lunch because I just realized, like, this whole thing that I had expected that was easy to kind of answer at the family barbecue of, like, oh, I'm going to be a consultant. All of that just kind of withered away. And so Mike, Brian, and myself all had this, like, instant moment right about the time of graduation where we just realized, like, this is not going to work for ourselves. And so the idea, when we talked about, like, what are we going to do with our lives, the answer to that was really simple. It was just, we've got to talk to people that have already figured it out. Who out there has combined interests and actually figured out a life that they love? And so we literally just thought, let's travel around the country. How do we do that? We can't afford hotels. Cool, we'll get an RV. So this is our beat up 1985 green RV. We painted it green with paint from Home Depot that was on sale. We literally just, like, rolled it on. Like, it's just caked over the blinker lights and everything. It really was unsafe. And then we started just cold calling. We had no connections. The idea was just like anybody who sounded interesting, we wanted to talk to them. And we spent about almost a year putting this road trip together, just sitting at mom and dad's house, like cold calling all day long. So I booked an interview with Sandra Day O'Connor from the 1-800 number on the Tours and Information website for the Supreme Court. I cold called Michael Dell from the 1-800 number on a commercial where you're supposed to buy your computer. My fax cover sheet was my face placed against the glass of the copy machine to Michael Dell, just trying to stand out in some silly way. Mike called the director of Saturday Night Live every 3 days for 3 months until she finally picked up on stage getting ready for rehearsals of the MTV Music Awards. And we just hounded all these different people that we thought were really interesting. And that road trip was really exceptional for us. It started as this like simple idea that we were going to try and figure out our own life. But what changed was probably 2 weeks into that road trip, we realized it was so much different. It was much bigger. These conversations that we were having needed to kind of go beyond our lives. So from that first road trip, we've been spending the last 15 years since 2001 committed to this idea of sharing with other people how other successful individuals have defined their own roads in life. And so I want to kind of just walk you guys through how that's evolved. You know, the first piece, when we came back, we had all this footage. We had never edited anything. We never filmed anything. But we thought the best way to share an experience is just to film it. So we learned how to edit with a manual from Barnes & Noble on Final Cut Pro. We learned how to like film from like people's advice. And ultimately, that first road trip became a 1-hour special that we put together. It aired on maybe 8 public television stations. But it really started to grow, and so we decided in 2003 that we would shift and put other people on the road. So our road trip was the only one we were in front of the camera. Every year after that, we've been putting new groups of road trippers out to interview new people who they really connect with. So this is just an example of what it's evolved to today. We're in pre-production on season 13 of this series on public television. We've done 116 episodes so far. About 85 different road trippers have road tripped with us. So it's been growing. I think we're in RV number 11 in terms of purchased, 3 currently working. The original RV is our conference room. We had an RV in Australia, New Zealand. We've done road trips in Israel, all different places. This is kind of the interview archive that we've put together. So if you look at that show, if you look at 116 hours or 116 episodes of content, we really thought there's got to be a really dynamic way to explore this rather than just episodes. So we started to pull out every single interview and put it up online. And so right now we've got about 425 of the interviews that we've got up there, a couple thousand videos all encompassed in that. And it's people from all different walks of life. And we've got schools. In 2008, we started a nonprofit that takes this content and turns it into curriculum for high school students. And just to give you an idea of the types of people that are in this archive, if you just think about the Craigs, we interviewed Craig Newmark. He's the founder of Craigslist. We interviewed Craig Brewer. He wrote and directed the film Hustle and Flow. We interviewed Craig Venter. He is the guy who decoded the human genome. And Craig Robinson, who's the author, former educator, comedian on The Office. So I wanted to kind of just show you guys what one interview looks like. This is an interview with a team that we put on the road, actually from Oakland. You'll see them twice in this presentation. And I think it's really exciting to just kind of look at one snippet. This is just 3 minutes of Andrew Lynn's story, and what you'll see is a conversation that's much deeper. We're not asking them, how much does a conservator make? Like, what was your necessary education? That stuff we can find online thanks to Google. We wanted to know the deeper questions, like, did you always know what you wanted to do? Like, how do you value your sense of self? Like, what did you do with risk? And how did you find an occupation that relates to your interests? And so this is just a little glimpse into one of our interviews.
I feel like personal with this, like nobody gets to do this.
You're right.
And so
you're going to be one of maybe 25 people together.
Yeah.
Get up here.
Isn't that cool? Like that's cool, and that's your job, And I think that's amazing.
When I was your age, I was thinking of 2 careers. One was medicine, and one was art. I decided that medicine my parents would approve of art. No. So I took a job first as an orderly. I helped with autopsies and stuff like that. And then I had a bad car accident. I drove a car over a bridge. That took a little while to get over. And I reconsidered what were the most important things, in what order, and what would give me the best feeling of having done something with my life that I wanted to do. So I said, well, I really always had loved art, so I spent several years doing art after that. I ran into a professor who was teaching Baroque art. He said, oh, have you ever heard of this profession, conservation? They seem to combine art and science. I said, oh, I better look into that. So I went to New York and talked to several people there, and then I ended up doing that.
You've been told to us as being one of the best conservation people in the country, if not the best.
Well, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble now.
I mean, I'm just saying that coming from you wanting to, go into the medical profession to please your parents, to doing this, which is, completely different. Are you glad that you went down the path that you did instead of going to be a doctor first, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm glad the more I reflect back on what I've done that I made the choice I did, because this profession, for me, satisfies all the things that I think are important, that I have skills at. No matter what you do, you've got to use as much energy and brain power as you've got to do it as well as you can do it all the time, because you don't get the seconds back. You don't get the minutes back. You don't get the days back that have gone by. And there's so many things to do. Do them as well as you possibly can. Take it all out and make it as good as you can. But do it, the things that make you feel like you've spent your time well, and that at the end you'll be happy, if not proud of your life. That's what I think about more as I get older. What are you going to think when you finally have to answer, was your life spent well enough?
So that's just a little glimmer into what these conversations are like. Average interview is probably an hour and a half. I think when we interviewed the first photographer for Rolling Stone magazine, it was a 2.5-hour interview marathon. But it's really amazing to just get in these people's very personal stories. And I think some of my favorite moments are those places where you watch somebody lean back and pause and say, I haven't thought about this in years. And you really get down to the core of who these individuals are. It's been exciting. Like, if you look at kind of where we've started to now, we've done about 100, we've probably traveled over 120,000 miles across the countries, back and forth many times. We're upwards of probably just over 1,000 interviews that we've conducted. And all of this content has been just in our head, and it's been sequential in terms of the television series, in terms of the curriculum. When we started to think about 2 years ago about what would a book be like, we really started thinking, we did not want to write a book about our story. We didn't want this kind of anecdotal thing of like, hey, we did this road trip, we figured out our life. As long as you take a road trip too, you will as well. It was like, there's so many of the like Me Too, like 5-point step solutions that guarantee success after 100 pages or something like that. And we really didn't want that. We wanted something that like encapsulated thousands of conversations and hundreds of hours of interviewing. Actually, that's the other way around, right? So we ended up starting about 2 years ago on a book. It just came out, and I wanted to show you just a little bit of a piece that we put together for the book, and then we'll kind of dive in for the rest of the session on it.
The reason why I went on this road trip is to talk to a bunch of people who have made careers out of something that they love.
What were you doing in your 20s or in college? What were you thinking?
Did you really not feel pressure?
Your family expects so much of you, society expects so much of you.
How do you bridge that gap between what I want to do and doing?
I've been going along this trip. I've been really trying to pay attention to people who have made something, a lifestyle, a career, when they haven't had a blueprint. Because I feel like I don't have a blueprint. I'm just trying to figure it out.
This is all a part of an evolution that's building you to go somewhere.
Well, I'll tell you this story.
I sort of see it as like your future self is leading you in some sense.
The 20s, to me, it's about having experience.
Here's a very important thing I want to tell you.
I encourage young people to question everything.
It's the journey that's really going to... Success isn't logical.
So the trick.
You just have to like run
What
at it.
is it that's going to make you happy?
This was a 45-minute conversation, and it changed my entire life.
I think if I could articulate the hardest thing about putting this book together, it was that we wanted to honor the reality of how people figure out their lives. And we didn't want to gloss over the complexity of it. So to give you like a perfect example of this, within 100 miles, we interviewed two people. Dion Clark, who's a nuclear engineer, and Paul Salapak is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winning writer. And Dion Clark was this engineer who said, the best thing you can do is take a skill and focus it and dig as deep as you can in that skill. And you will gain so much expertise around that that you'll be invaluable. And you can take that skill anywhere you want. And then 50 miles, 100 miles later, Paul Salapak has a totally different experience. Dion was a nuclear engineer, nuclear engineer on a nuclear submarine. So he was running a submarine at age 19 with like 30 people underneath him. Paul Salapak had a totally different experience. He had explored all these different types of places in his life. And he said the best thing you can do is go broad, to have a great amount of different experiences and to put those together in a very unique way. And so in 100 miles, we have two people saying the exact opposite thing. And so as we put this book together, we were really trying to think, like, how do we honor that? How do we put that together? And ultimately, we decided to come up with this. And it's what we call this process of self-construction. It's a circular process, let go, define, become. It's one that you repeat over and over again. And it's really an open framework. If software had an analogy, this is an open source platform. What we really felt was important here is this process that we saw consistently across the board. That people had this noise of society, this peer pressure. They ultimately had to let that go before they could really think about who they were in their own right. Then they had to define what was important to them with that noise away and then actually become that. And that only lasts for so long. You do that, your life changes, your values change, your interests change, and then you have to pick that process up again. And so this has really been the core piece of the book, let go, define, become. And what we'll do for the rest of the session is just kind of walk through that. And I'm going to try and bring as many people into, as many people from the conversations that we've had into the presentation. Everybody that you see here is both in the book, and then also as part of the book, you get access to all the video archive of it. So the first part is let go. It's very simple. It's just about stepping away from all of that noise, all of that static, and really getting to the core of who you are. And a key part of that is this idea of shedding the noise. The noise, as we kind of define it, is everything that comes at you in a way that doesn't take your own individual identity into account. It's that inauthentic, like, you should be a lawyer, you should be a doctor, you're not smart enough to be a doctor. You could never go to college, you have to go to college. It's all of these different elements that we're always kind of inundated from. And they can come from our families, they can come from our peers, but they can also come from ourselves. That self-doubt is, in many respects, noise that has come from the outside and then we've accepted it as our own. And to just kind of illustrate an example, if any of you saw Boyhood, this is Richard Linklater. He wrote and directed the film. When he told his parents, you know, I'm interested in writing, I think I'm going to be a writer, a director, they really scoffed at him and they said, no, this family, like, we don't do that. Like, we're a family of doctors and lawyers. And I think they were really well-meaning, but like, that was their experience. And the best that they could think about from a writer, he said, was they said, well, maybe you could write children's books. But he really kind of had this place of just realizing that he needed to let that noise go. And he really went on his own pursuit. He worked at an oil rig, an offshore oil rig, for an entire year to save up enough money so that the next year he could move into a small apartment, buy as many film books and as much film equipment, and learn the art of film on his own. And that was his process of shedding the noise. This is one of my most painful and favorite quotes to illustrate the noise. This is Gletta Goodacre. She had her first class ever in sculpting. This is what her teacher said. I had a sculpting teacher who told me I was stupid, dumb, and ignorant and couldn't see three-dimensionally. Gletta Goodacre is the woman who sculpted the Sacagawea $1. She's also the woman who is most notably recognized for the Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. You can imagine what that had to feel like for her and the power that it took for her to overcome that. So as you guys just kind of think, just pause for a moment and think, like, what is your noise? What were those pieces that came either from yourself or from your peers that really kind of stuck with you? And did those shape your life, or were you able to kind of resist them? As we look at resisting the noise, there's a couple stories I'll share. This is Caroline Thompson. She's the screenwriter for Corpse Bride and Edward Scissorhands. And she had this beautiful analogy that I love, which is just, the noise is sometimes these tapes in our head. And we just have to eject those tapes and put in our own. We have to start writing our own scripts as opposed to accepting the scripts of other people. And when we really look at it, I wanted to kind of take you guys back to that Oakland team that we saw earlier. This is Jeff Johnson. They interviewed him about 2,000 miles later than the other interview that you saw. And he speaks really articulately both about the noise that we get from others, as well as the box that we put ourselves in when we accept that noise.
I'm going to ask this question because, like I said, I've wanted to go to law school all my life since I was little. And now I find that I don't want to do that anymore, but instead, I want to take this path over here, and I want to do something in music. And I feel like I'm giving up on law school. So what is giving up, and what is just deciding to do something else?
Man, here is the key to the cell that you've created for yourself. What I'm saying is, you ever wanted to do something so much that you tell everybody you want to do it, you share with everybody that this is what you're going to do, and then now what you're trying to live up to is the expectations that you created for everybody else. So my mom and them is expecting me to go to law school, not because they told me, but because I said that's what I was going to do. But the bottom line is, you created that cell. Nobody else created it for you, which means you got the keys to say, you know what, y'all, I changed my mind. I don't want to do this no more. And if people agree or disagree, so what? They don't have to live your life. They don't have to go to work every day. They don't have to pay your bills. They don't have to raise your children. They don't have to be the ones that are responsible for your light and your gift. So if you decide that you don't want to do that anymore, then tell the people who you said, you know what, y'all, some stuff has happened to me, and I don't want to do this. And you've got to be honest enough with yourself to understand, is this something I was created to do, or is this just something I like? Is this something I was created to do, or this is something I think gonna make me look good? Because what I see a lot of young people doing especially, is they think that they were created to do something because they ain't seen nothing else, or they haven't opened their minds up to other opportunities. But so often we confine ourselves to this little box of doctor, lawyer, engineer, teacher, business person. Free yourself, sis. This is my kingdom.
Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
The conversation, the wisdom, everything, man.
Thank you.
What I love about Jeff is just the idea that we put ourselves in the box. And as we looked at kind of how we wanted to round out that first section of Let Go, it really ends with this chapter called The Blank Canvas. And the take there is, if we really accept that noise, we're living a life of paint by numbers. And the more we can strip away and wash those instruction manuals away, the more we can really start from a clean slate and really think about who we are. And so that's kind of how we end that process of Let Go. And that brings us into Define. I think the thing about Define for us is that I think before we started on the road trip, we had this expectation that all of these different people had always had it figured out. So when we sat down with Howard Schultz from Starbucks, we figured he always knew he was really into coffee, and he just knew how to do that. When we sat down with David Nealman, who started JetBlue, we just figured that guy, he's all about planes, straight line to success. Wanda Sykes, same thing. She probably was the funniest person in our class, always had confidence up on stage, and she killed it every time. After those interviews, we realized that Howard Schultz was the first in his family to go to college. And in college, he was so poor, he was donating blood to have enough money to eat. You hear David Nealman talk about being an executive vice president at Southwest Airlines and then being fired, and how devastating that was for him, and how he had to rebuild his sense of self and his identity and what he wanted to create, which ultimately resulted in JetBlue. And we learned that Wanda Sykes, for years, was working at the NSA. That was her way of paying the bills while she gained this confidence, while she became a comedian. And so it was a really kind of eye-opening piece to us to think that like people didn't just become instantly. They moved in incremental steps. And I think a great example of that is this guy. He is one of my favorite interviews of recent. His name's Adam Stelzner. When Adam was first kind of looking around, the only thing he knew he was interested in was nothing. He had no driver. He was not particularly compelled by anything. He would start things and then kind of back off them. He isn't sure if he graduated from high school. He was like one grade away and decided I just won't go back and check those transcripts to see. And at the point of his story really starting, he said, I was playing in a band, and every night I was driving home over the Bay Bridge, and I noticed that the stars moved in the sky. And he says this in like an admission of ignorance and like irony, that like he had no idea that the stars moved in the sky, that the moon is in a different place each day, that Orion is not here, but it's there the next month. And so on that simple little why do the stars move, he decided to go to an astronomy class at a local junior college and just say, I'm going to figure this out. Why? And it just kind of bit. Like that was an interest, this idea about space and how these things come together, how formulas can really govern the rules of how things move, both in space and on Earth. And he just started to kind of follow that. And that was a drip, and then the next degree was a drip. And he all of a sudden finds himself enraptured by this interest of the stars. He lands a job at JPL, and he starts engineering landings. They said, you know, like, he became the go-to guy for complex problems about how to land things in space. And to start from the guy that didn't know the stars moved, he ultimately was the one that engineered the landing or led the landing on the Mars Curiosity rover. So when you saw that, what was it? They called it, I think, 7 minutes of terror. That was his team putting that together. And he's ultimately responsible, him and the team at JPL, for landing that rover. And it just was such an empowering piece for us to realize, like, people didn't always have it figured out. And I think that his story is so much more consistent than the very few minority of the individuals that we met with that said, oh, I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and I just became a writer. That is like the almost 0%. And I think that really ties into this idea of career. From our perspective, from all these 1,000+ interviews, what we really see is that our current way in which we approach career is kind of like taking binoculars and looking at them backwards. You know, if we look at that experience of going to the Career Center, more often than not, it's this idea that you just pick an occupation in the future and then reverse engineer backwards. If you're in a career, it's pick the next career and then reverse engineer backwards. What are the skills? What are the degrees that I need? But what we saw was the total different approach. The people that really found themselves happy and engaged in the work that they were doing, they followed a simple thing, and it was just a simple piece, which is they followed their interests. This is Richard Meyer. He was the architect for the Getty Museum. And he said, when I was growing up, my parents had a basement in their house, and I had a drafting board where I would make drawings and model boats and paper airplanes. I just liked making things. He didn't say, I want to be an architect. I think for the most part, when we say, I'm going to be a consultant, it's to end that awkward conversation at the family barbecue. What we saw was people really gaining their own sense of identity was when they just said, I have this interest and I'm going to pursue it and I'm going to see where it goes. And so if there was one core piece that I would say that is about Roadtrip Nation, that is about this book, it is pursue your interests, not an occupation. And we have seen that time and time again. When we started to think about pursuing the interests, we also looked at how to kind of put that together. And what we saw was this idea of this framework called the roadmap. And that's ultimately what we named the book after. It's this idea that you're mashing together multiple interests. Because when we went to JDK Design, we weren't just interviewing a designer. We were interviewing the designer that puts art on snowboards. When we went and saw Adam Stelzner, it's not just science or engineering. It's those combined together with space. It's all these people combining multiple things together. And what we started to look at was, more often than not, there was something deeper. There was this thing which we refer to as a foundation. So for me, like Richard Meyer, it really doesn't matter what I'm doing. I will be lit up with almost anything as long as I'm making things, as long as I'm building something. The interest that I have, design and technology, that's the way I manifest it. But making things, whether it's Legos with my daughter, a website, a boat, anything, that's really what lights me up. And so we saw time and time people were finding their own foundation and then combining multiple interests. And so this is a really good example of an interview just up the road from Anna.
I went to UC Berkeley, and I started out as a philosophy major and an art major. And then I took anthropology. And then I thought, you know, I'm gonna do theater. And then after I got out, I was like, I'm just gonna try to get a real job. But I wanted to be in a place that felt right, and I applied to the Asian Art Museum. I applied for the program assistant position in performing arts. And I have museum experience. I had my anthro background, I had theater. It just kind of came together, and it was totally unplanned. The thing is, I never knew a job like what I have now existed or could exist. I just sort of positioned myself with things that really felt right. It's really a matter of instinct on some level and a broad plotting of things. Your path is what you make of it. There are positions out there, there are careers out there that you can fit into, but there are also things that you can make yourself, and you have to just trust that you have something unique to offer and to be consistent with that in your choices.
And what I really love about her is she is mashing these pieces up. She's mashing up anthropology, theater, and in the context of a museum. And to give you guys some more examples of people we've interviewed, this is Peter Travers. He's a film critic at Rolling Stone magazine. He's all about sharing stories with film and journalism, and you could probably add in music there if you wanted from Rolling Stone. We've got Jessica Matthews. She's CEO of Uncharted Play. She's all about helping people in sports and technology. You might have seen her. She was one of the engineers of the soccer ball that small rural communities in Africa could play with. And during the day, while they're kicking it, through the motion generated as movement, it's storing energy, and they can then plug an actual light into that soccer ball and use it as light in their homes in the evening. It's an amazing story, and she is combining science into sports and helping people all together. If you look at Jamu Green, when we interviewed her, she was the president of Rock the Vote. She's upholding a cause that she believes in, but she's not doing it in the abstract. She's doing it in music and politics. And when we sat down with Ariel Hawani, he was all about accomplishing goals. This was a guy who really had this goal of getting into MMA reporting, but he was deathly afraid of the limelight. He was petrified of other people. When he was in college, he lived in the dorms, and he literally would wait till 2 a.m. to go brush his teeth. He was that afraid of people, but his goal was to be a reporter for MMA. I have no idea why he chose that goal, but that was his thing, and he started small. He started in a local radio station where he could just put his headphones on and his hoodie and talk into the mic. Then he started a blog, added some video to that blog of doing interviews with fighters, and all of a sudden, like, he is the guy at AOL. He's like one of the key people in the MMA space. And I wanted to kind of just take a little bit more time to tell you a story that really articulates, I think, a lot of what we've talked about before in terms of shedding the noise, in terms of kind of evolving this kind of idea of drip, drip, splash, and then mashing up of interest. So this is Jimmy Chin. He's a skier. He's a rock climber. He's an adventurer. He's a North Face athlete. Probably a month before we interviewed him, he had just shot the photo of the cover of National Geographic with Alex Hahn just standing on the ledge with no ropes. So that was Jimmy Chin's photo. But he came from a very traditional family. His parents were very much focused on education. And he did a lot of things to make them happy. He was an accomplished violin player. He really pursued college in a place where it wasn't maybe necessarily the thing that he would have chosen. But he did these things to make them happy, and he said that the one thing he chose for himself to do was rock climbing. And so he said after college to his parents, just give me 1 year. I'm just gonna climb for 1 year, ski for 1 year, and see what happens. And then I'll go get that job. I'll be that lawyer. He literally thought that there was 3 options, just be a doctor, be a lawyer, or be a business person. And I think all of those are totally admirable occupations. They just weren't right for Jimmy. So he said, just give me a time to kind of live my piece first. So he started at literally just this simply rock climbing. And that interest grew, and he was getting more and more accomplished in rock climbing. And then one day on a climb, one of his buddies was trying to learn to take photographs and wanted to start a business of taking photographs. And they were on this pitch, and his buddy couldn't quite get the angle that he wanted, so he handed the camera to Jimmy, and he said, hey, will you just take this photo? Like, whatever you can, just take a photo. Whatever, a couple weeks went by, and that friend came back to him, and he was like, yeah, I sold a photo. It was your photo. The only photo this guy sold was the photo that Jimmy took on that camera. And at the time, Jimmy was living in his car, he was rock climbing, and he got $500 for that photo. And he just sat there and said, if all I need to do is sell like 12 photos, and I can live for the entire year. And he just kept going. It was just this pursuing of this interest. He lived in that car for 6 years, but his skills and his interests were evolving. It went from rock climbing to high Himalayan climbing to these really extensive expeditions. And then it even went further to leading really complex expeditions in remote locations. And what's interesting about Jimmy's story at this point was he said, you know, I couldn't have led these expeditions without that education that I had, without these experiences that I've had before. Because people didn't need, when they're gonna go climb a crazy peak, you couldn't get a team that said, okay, I need one photographer, I need one videographer, one climber, and then one operations guy. You need somebody that brings all of those things together. And Jimmy, through his experience, through that pursuing of these interests and this kind of step-by-step approach, really created this place where he was one of the few people that could take on some of these things. And when he asked him, you know, what advice would you have to like people trying to define their own road, he simply used this climbing reference, which I think really applies, which is commit and figure it out. You know, he committed to rock climbing, that evolved to photography, that evolved to leading these expeditions, that evolved to videography, to starting a production company. And if you have any interest on Instagram, check out his feed. It's really inspiring. So at this point, just kind of reflect on your own roadmap. Imagine what are the interests that you would smash together? What are the things that, if noise was non-existent, if you really had that freedom, you know, what would be that thing that you would kind of take? And this gets us into the become piece, the last section of the book. And I think as we started putting this book together, I think the worst advice that I think I've ever received and I could give to anybody would be follow your passions. Because I think there's a huge problem with that. It makes it sound like you should know it already. It makes you sound like this thing is so big that you've only got one passion. It's like find that right one partner in this world, the perfect match. And what we saw was people did not approach their life that way. They dipped their toe in the water. A woman that we interviewed over here at Google, she said, you're looking at me now in this occupation and in the success that I have, and you think I'm doing so well. But you didn't see all the steps that I got here. And her analogy was beautiful. She said, it's like you're looking at somebody who's swimming in cold ocean. They didn't just run in there and jump and say, oh, this is great. You know, she's like, I ran down there, I put my toe in the water, it was freezing, I backed off. I ran in there, I got down to my knees, it was too cold, I failed again, I ran back off. And eventually, she gets to the place where she's neck deep and then she's swimming. But we connect these dots that really aren't there. And so this idea that you should follow your passion's the destination if you do it all right, but it's not an approach. It's really following your interest and exploring that passion and find validation where your passion meets, or your interests meet your skills, and you arrive at that place of passion. But it's just not a reasonable bit of advice to give anybody. And we have not seen that come into play with the people we've interviewed. I think the most apt example of these baby steps is this interview that we had with Gebhard, the co-founder and host of Radiolab. And he has this great analogy that he pulls called the adjacent possible from science. So we'll just tap into it.
One thing that comes up a lot is we're about defining our own roads as opposed to not taking somebody else's road. But how did you kind of take it to that next level of like, you need to be more open to other options and things like that?
Let me get abstract for a second. I'm going to bring in some highfalutin, and you can tell me to be concrete. But there's this theory in evolution called the adjacent possible, which is that if you imagine like the primordial soup is full of all these chemicals, like arsenic was in there, there's amino acids floating around. Those things aren't going to suddenly bump into each other and create a human being, or even a flower. So it's not part of the possibility of that space to create the flower, But you can take an amino acid and you can take a fat cell, you can slam them together. Suddenly you've got a cell, and suddenly that cell has more possibilities. A two-celled organism, and eventually an amoeba or something, I don't know. So you have to ask yourself, what is your adjacent possible in some sense? Like right now you're starting out, you're in a way in your own primordial soup of dreams. But you have to think of your possibilities in both the most expansive and the most constrained. Like, okay, I can't be Michael Jordan, but maybe I could go play in a pickup game, and work on my jump shot, or something like that. There's a way in which you always have to ask yourself, what is possible right outside my border?
I think that piece of possibility is very in line with everything that we've experienced with Road Trip. We had no idea how to film. We had no idea how to write a book. But we figured there was some baby steps that we could take along the way. The other piece that I love is this quote by Veronica Belmont. She says, if you're really passionate about a topic and you want to work in that field, you should already be doing it. And I think that translates and is kind of a main piece for the chapter in the book called Practice Schmactus. The idea that like what your coaches would always say is practice makes perfect. And I think we would really say that from our experience, doing makes perfect. There's probably is no such thing as perfect. But it's the actual act of doing. If you want to be an actor, you're an actor the second you turn a camera on yourself and start acting. If you want to be a writer, you're a writer the second you start a blog. If you're into editing, start that now. I think the world has changed in a way that the avenues to get into something that you're interested are right in front of us. We can open a store on Etsy for free. We can do all of these different things. There are many different ways to engage in your interest. And her point, I think, is just so poignant because we should already be doing it. We should already be using every decision that we make and tying that into the interest that we have. The other piece, as we think about becoming, is failure. And this is a guy that we interviewed, Craig Brewer. He wrote a film called Hustle and Flow. And the song in Hustle and Flow was nominated for an Oscar. And he was an amazing guy who told us a story about a film that he had shot, spent $40,000 on, and it was so bad he didn't even pay to have it developed. Can you imagine spending 40 grand on something and then just saying, it's so bad I can't go any further? So this is somebody that was really experienced in failure, and if you ever see the film Hustle and Flow, it very much ties into his own personal story in a very dynamic way. But he talked about getting to failure, and I think that the idea of failure is something that we hear all the time, like learn from your failures, and I know culturally at Google this probably resonates well. You guys are exceptionally well at just rapid iteration, but I think for the most part when we apply this to our lives, learn from your failures translates into, avoid failing, and then if you do, just cover it up by saying I'm learning. And Craig takes a totally different approach here. He says if you want to get to something, you have to actually seek out failure. And I'll let him do the talking.
I wanted to go into film when I was younger, but I didn't feel like I had what it takes to become a filmmaker. I didn't feel like I could put out like my creativity out there. I didn't feel I had the guts to do that.
Interesting.
So now I feel like I could do it, but I guess that's the main question for me. Is like one of the main questions is like, what are my fears?
What are some of them?
Fear of failure is definitely always there.
Well, are you perfectly clear on the fact that you will? Are you cool with that? I mean, you know that you're going to fail repeatedly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, the only way that you're going to get good is if you fail. So, like, get to failing. Like, get that process going, you know? Don't put that off, because it's going to hurt more when you're older. And what ends up happening, you know, that I've seen, is people don't want that hurt. And so they get married, they have kids, and then they blame their families and their circumstances for the fact that they didn't want to fail. They didn't want to risk. They didn't want to feel that kind of pain. So I say that if you want it, you know, if you want that enrichment of success, then you know, get busy failing, you know, because it will happen.
And when we talk about like which failures do you choose, I think most of us kind of think in this duality of safe versus risk. And we had this great interview with Jonathan Poman. He was the founder of Sub Pop Records. They covered anybody or managed anybody from Nirvana all the way up to the Shins. And he said, you know, if you look at making decisions between safety and risk, the natural inclination that we as humans have is to protect and not to choose risky things. It's to be safe. And he said the way he approached life and the perspective shift that enabled him to make those decisions was to change the dynamic and make the decisions not on what is safe or risky, but on what is necessary versus unnecessary. For him, happiness was necessary. For us, it might be our family is necessary. Whatever it is that is necessary versus unnecessary, it's a much easier way to look at a yes or no decision. What things do you explore? You know, those things that give you life, those things are necessary versus worrying about things that are risky. To leave you guys with a challenge today, we thought just very simply, reflect on your own roadmap. Reflect on the thing that drives you, that thing that you would be happy doing no matter what, that foundational element and those interests combined. If you were to shed that noise and really think about how all of that could come together in a dynamic way, you know, very simply, just today, what's your adjacent possible? What's the small little thing that you could do today that just gets you one step further? And it might be that you're loving exactly what you're doing now, but how can you take it further? Can you follow somebody new on Twitter? Can you take a new class? Can you explore some interest that you've never had? You know, whatever it is, break it down into some baby step and just go for it. And to kind of close it off before Q&A, this is how we close the book. This is, if you open up the book, this is the last quote in the book. And rather than read it to you, I'd rather her just share it. So this is Stacy N. Chin. She's a poet and activist we interviewed in New York.
Attempt the impossible. Do the crazy. Stand on a limb and teeter. I say teeter away. Reach, leap, attempt things that everyone says can't be done. Run, jump, move, walk, get your crazy done. You are your bravest self. And when I say brave, I don't mean the quiet courage that it takes to raise a child. I mean the courage to do what no one else is doing. These are the years to climb a mountain. These are the years to break an arm. These are the years to fall in love and recover and fall in love again and recover and to make love in 100 different cities and shave your head and take a year off from your life to do something that makes no sense to anyone else. do it now and live it. You know, if you want to write, if you want to make films, anything you want to do, you have to live to be able to do it first. So live. Get it out of your system so that when it is that you have an ankle that is sore and you have, bills to pay, that there are no regrets behind you. It's, the heaviest thing you will have to carry as you move forward is regret. Make sure you're not carrying too much.
So with that, I'd like to bring up my other co-authors and field any Q&A that you guys have. So as a matter of introduction here, we have Alyssa, who runs all of our copy, Willie, who directs our public television series, Jamie, who's also a director in Filmer, and Annie, who runs all of our educational curriculum. So this is the team that put this book together. There's a much larger team at the office, but primarily this was that core team. None of us are writers. We all do different things.
Hey, well, speak for yourself.
Oh, okay. Well, sorry. Aside from Alyssa, we're not writers. So, with that, if you guys have any questions, we can jump into that. Or I'm sure you guys probably have some things that I missed, and you can share that or share some experience of writing the book. I think a fun fact here is that we really wrote the book on a Google Doc. Yeah. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it.
I had a question about the interests element of it, because it also is easy to say, oh, just follow your interests, and a lot of people don't know, like, and especially when I mentor students and stuff, they'll say, well, I like basketball, right? It's like, well, everybody's not going to be in the NBA, and there's not a lot of those opportunities out there. Getting into sports marketing is really difficult and stuff. So how do you choose which interests to pursue, and then also how do you identify what interests, are the passion points or the strong ones, I guess?
I'll start by just saying the first thing that came to my mind, because I think you're absolutely right. That's an awesome point. Because, so I come from the public television series side, and so part of my job is to go through this pool of applicants of young people that are looking for what they want to do with their life and take them out on the road and sort of try and get into their heads and capture their journeys. And I think the biggest element of that experience, and a lot of what we're trying to do with the book, is to emulate this element of that experience, and that's the exposure side of it. Because I think before you can really, and basketball is a perfect example. When we go to high schools and we bring our curriculum out, that actually comes up maybe like 50% of the time, I want to be a basketball player. And one of the first things that we tell them, and one of the things that is a good metaphor for what happens no matter what they're interested in, is realizing how deep that rabbit hole actually goes within the world of basketball and how many different types of jobs there are in that realm. And so that exposure piece is a huge part that comes from, I think, pursuing that initial interest and then seeing what else comes around that. And I think what Nate brought up in the beginning, which is like the kind of cyclical nature of the roadmap experience that we were trying to come up with, is going to which ones do you explore? It's almost like instead of picking that one that's going to be the one that you stick with forever, it's more like pick that first one. Like, what's next? Like, what do you want to try right now? And then once you get into that world, you start experiencing that, a lot of things will be revealed, like, am I good at it? Or is there something, is it as interesting? Is it sustainable? All these things will be revealed to the point where at some point, like I have in my life, I think like how most people that we've interviewed have in their life, they'll have to step back and kind of reevaluate that and maybe think, oh yeah, actually now I'm interested in this. So that's where that kind of cyclical nature comes in. And I think that's one of the most comforting things I've seen the road trippers learn when they're out there is, oh, I'm not deciding what I'm doing forever. I'm deciding what I'm doing like this year. And I'll reevaluate that. And like Jimmy Chin, like so many people, what I did choose, what I did explore will become valuable in some, unexpected way. But yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also about recognizing how your interest intersects with your skills, because I think a lot of us think like, we think so myopically, like I like basketball, I want to be Jordan. Oh, I like rap music, I want to be a rapper. And I think that it's about recognizing, okay, well, maybe with basketball, I certainly couldn't be a basketball player, but I could write about it. I could, get into marketing. I could design the ball. There's just, I think, an infinite amount of ways to materialize your interests, and it's not always obvious, but you have to just figure out where they where they align together with your skills. There's a chapter in the book called Skills Pay the Bills. So obviously you have to attach it to some economic engine in order to have a career that pays those bills.
So it seems like a lot of the folks who were on those road trips, there were young people, right? The people who were right out of college or early 20s, that kind of age group. Do you think that your message changes at all for people who are not that young, who are maybe mid-career or later in life? Does the calculus change as far as risk tolerance and how do you convey your message to people who aren't in that same age demographic?
Yeah.
I've been talking.
You go on.
That's a really good question, and we get that question often. And I think Nate touched upon it too, just the idea of these inflection points, and that whether you're a middle school student, someone who is just entering college, graduating from college, trying to figure out, like, is this first job of mine right for me? Do I need another job? What am I going to do next? All the way to, oh no, I retired, but I still have 30 years left to live. What am I going to do? I think whenever you're at a place in your life where you have to start thinking, well, what do I enjoy? And maybe it's changed a little bit. I think you can still go back to this process of let go, define, become. And I know, Nate, you've spoken a lot about just kind of the risk then and the change in that like equation that you were talking about, that what if you have a mortgage to pay? What if you have 4 children at home and you might not be able to just pick up and get in a van and go climb a mountain? So it does definitely change, but I think that's why we tried to simplify the message of let go, define, become, because you can alter each of those 3 words to fit where you're at whichever inflection point you're at.
I think you hit the nail on the head from my perspective, which is that tolerance of risk. Where we were at when we started Road Trip, sure, we could leave for 3 months and do that deal. Now with 3 young daughters, like, I don't have that flexibility or that ability to take that leap. A really good example of that is this guy named Tinker Hatfield. He was came from a sports family, but came out and was working as an architect and really found himself wanting that sports piece. And he didn't say, oh, I'm just going to quit and like start totally new life. I think his approach was, how can I kind of take a lateral move into the sports piece? And for him, it was really, as he kind of divulged into his own interest, it was sports and it was design. And architecture is a proximity to that, but it's not true. And so what he did is he literally just went, well, maybe I can be an architect at Nike. And so he made this lateral move. And then once he was at Nike, then he started drilling down. And so it wasn't like, I'm going to quit, make no money, live in my car story. It was, okay, I've got these responsibilities. I'll make a lateral move and then I'll move down. And he is ultimately the guy that led all of the design work for all of Jordan's shoes, and he's now the vice president of innovation. And I think it's about adjusting that level of risk for that time in your life. And certainly earlier and later, there's those opportunities, particularly as it relates to family, where you've got more latitude. And sometimes those leaps can be bigger, and sometimes they need to be more incremental.
Yeah, and one thought that I had while you were talking about that, and it's not so much related to risk, but I think working here and seeing all these interviews, one of the big things I've seen is kind of reevaluating how much you're allowed to change who you are in your life and at what age you're supposed to have it figured out. And so lots of people who've gone back to school at like 30, 40, 50, and kind of getting rid of the noise that there's an expectation of like at 20 you have to have it figured out and that's who you are for your whole life, and opening up the possibility of like it's okay to decide that you're going to be somebody else at 40 or 50. And like socially, I think that's not really acceptable necessarily, but hearing it over and over again from multiple people who have done it has, for me, like broken down the sense of like one identity for your whole life, you know?
Yeah, Pam Gaber is a good story in that respect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we get so defined by our careers. I think when you go to a party, the question is, what do you do? And it becomes, it's sort of the sole source of our identity. But we all have this plethora of interests that we pursue, and the things that we might be most interested isn't even the thing we do 40 hours a week. But I think we live in a time where there's like unprecedented resources to explore those things and cultivate those little interests. YouTube tutorials, lynda.com. There's just so many resources out there to take little steps. And it doesn't have to be a giant leap, but I think that those iterative little things, they accumulate over time and can lead to
leads down the line.
Thank you guys very much.
Thanks, guys.